Okay. And with the closing of the doors, I think we're ready to begin. So I will try and close out today with a talk about building better shared experiences in your games. So first, hello. My name is Will, and I'm going to speak to you about the topics that you should be considering in trying to build experiences that your players are going to cherish. Now, specifically, I want to discuss how sharing those game experiences online can improve or detract from the enjoyment that we gain in the process of playing them. And that depends entirely on the design decisions that we make as developers in making them. Now, this is actually an extremely wide scope for a single talk, but I actually can't think of any other way to accomplish this. So I need to make sure that I can fully address the issues and give you something concrete that you can start applying to your development process to take away from this immediately. So I'm going to begin by deconstructing the problems that we'll encounter into their most basic form. At that point, I'm going to consider some of the tools and approaches that are used today in some other games, and we'll look at some of the results of what the state-of-the-art of multiplayer behavior engineering can do today. And the goal is to give you with some perspective that'll be useful in any situation. It doesn't matter what the concept is of your game, the genre of it, the budget, the setting, whatever. I believe that this is relevant to all disciplines of game development. So, before getting into the specifics, I should introduce myself a little bit. I'm a graduate of Michigan State University. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the geography, it's the red mitten over there. So that's where I earned a degree in computer science and a specialization in game development. There's also a master's program as well there that we studied with occasionally and sort of got me thinking about problems more than just how to make a game fun. So since graduating there, I've been working as a developer at Yeti CGI. It's a game studio that's also in Michigan. We're a studio that specializes in mobile and web game development. Now, in working for them, I've ended up supporting contracts for Zynga, the Game Show Network, Nickelodeon, and a slew of other companies that are rather well-to-do in the mobile and social space. And I've also been helping us shift our focus internally because that's really where we want to be. Our most recent game is Roaming Fortress. It's for all of the mobile platforms in Steam, and if you ever wanted to see what a tower defense looked like when placed on the back of a dinosaur, it's something like that. So check it out. So between my work experience, my education, participation in conferences like this one, my own independent research from a variety of sources, and a lifetime of enjoying these games thoroughly, I think I've come to you with something that's worth sharing. And I hope that you'll find this talk enjoyable, informative, and thought-provoking. So I think that's enough about me. Let's get down to business. So the idea for this talk began when I first met Elf at GGC 2013. We were at a talk that was given by Anita Sarkeesian, a game critic and the author of the video blog Feminist Frequency. Now, in her talk, she didn't talk about the blog specifically. She talked about the horrible abuse and harassment that she received at the hands of the gaming community for just raising some questions about the status quo of gender representation in our industry. And it was awful stuff. I mean, they steal her identity, harass her relatives in real life, and I mean, my colleagues at Stardoll showed you some of the images of what this vandalism took place. So afterwards, Ulf and I spoke about some of the tools and approaches that game developers have been using to try and address these issues of hate and malicious play in the products that we make every day. And, well, given my background, I immediately began looking at technical solutions. I thought that, there's got to be some way I can make this work with the right number of regular expressions and image recognition algorithms and statistical analysis. I can make this work, right? Well, as I began putting this talk together, I came to the conclusion that it's just not that simple of an issue. That really this is a bit more far-reaching than some code that doesn't do what we thought it was. Because although there are examples of mechanics that are being misused or not used the way they're intended to and being taken advantage by hackers and trolls, ultimately any solution that gives players the ability to communicate leads to stuff like that. I mean, anything that has players interacting can be misused. So the problem gets even worse when you start leaving the game. And your players will leave the game and they'll continue to talk about it. They'll make reviews, they'll send messages, either on Xbox Live and Steam or on their own blogs and Twitter, where you don't have access to any of the content restriction that you might be able to put into your own game. So in other words, the problem is outside of our game. The problem is that for some people that are going to play our games, hacking, shouting and typing hate speech into the game, and otherwise ruining the experience for everybody else, that's part of how they enjoy this game. And sometimes that's an intentional thing, sometimes it's not, it's just their inability to deal with their emotions in the game, but the end result is the same, and it's not as fun for everybody else. These antisocial behaviors are responsible for a lot of the negative stereotypes that are associated with gamers today, and unfortunately they prevent many people, even ourselves, from believing the real promise and possibilities that these new spaces have for us and our society, for seeing what a wonderful and complex benefit that they can offer people of all ages and backgrounds, and becoming a truly worthwhile and lifelong pastime. So what can we do then if players are having more fun in breaking our game experiences rather than sharing them? And I've thought about this quite a bit, and the only solution I can come with that seems to have any chance of succeeding is to make sharing the experience more fun than breaking it. And you can accomplish that by two strategies. First is by adding more social features into the game that just make it more awesome, that make it so that it's more fun to play this game the way that it was intended to be than trying to break it. And by secondly understanding that you're not going to get everybody with that. You're going to have to put in some safeguards around those experiences, those mechanics that are going to make it more difficult for people to negatively impact this experience and are going to reduce the impact when they do manage to break through. So I'm going to break the rest of this talk down into 4 primary design considerations that I think every game developer should have in considering how their game is going to be experienced online. The first is that every game developer needs to be thinking about the community that is built around their game. There are no exceptions to this rule. The second rule is that social features need to be designed and developed just like any other game feature. And again, this is no exceptions that I can think of. The third one is that you're going to need data to do this effectively. Again, there are no exceptions to this rule. And lastly, it can work. I swear. There's people doing this now. We'll talk about that. But there are some exceptions to this rule. So designing with these principles in mind is going to help you make smarter decisions about the platforms and features that you choose to target. And it will hopefully make you make a better game experience for your players. So let's get to it. The first point. This is everybody's problem. Every game developer is affected, and every game developer has an obligation both to themselves and to the game community to try and address this issue. We all know that building games is difficult, and achieving the design, technical, aesthetic goals, and creating a novel product is something that is hard enough without worrying about those pesky users that are going to come along and play with it. But there's a large variety of excuses that I've heard, some even come out of my own mouth, to explain why we weren't going to worry about social features. And while those seem reasonable, I'm here to tell you that they aren't. Believing these excuses can actually be extremely dangerous for developing your game. I'll provide some examples. Firstly, the idea that your single-player game means that it's not a shared experience is actually kind of laughable, again, because we're living in an internet-connected age. It doesn't matter how you distribute your game, whether you're just hosting it off of your website, you're going through Steam, Xbox Live, it's on a box somewhere in a store, because they still do that. The moment that somebody plays it and posts about it online, it's officially gets assimilated into the rest of this online community, and it's part of the discussion. It's part of shaping the norms and expectations that we have out of our games. So that's actually a great thing. Like, that might sound scary, but as a developer, you should be very excited about the idea that people are going to advertise for your game for you, and you should try to foster that as much as possible. And there's some great tools nowadays that can help us do this. There's all kinds of networks, depending on what kind of game you're going to be publishing, that can help get it in front of an audience, that can help play through the game and enjoy it more, and can even provide you with features that you otherwise might not have access to. That could be achievements, leaderboards, chat rooms, all these other sorts of things that can help your players collaborate in ways that you might not have the time to make on your own. But those come with risks, and they come with costs. You need to consider them. For example, how many times have you seen any of these in the description of a game and just sort of had your eyes glaze over? Like, big whoop, they have a Twitter account, that's so cool. On the other side of that, how many times have you consciously opted not to use a social feature of a game? Now, occasionally that's because you might be playing a game that you're well outside of the target demographic for. You don't really want to be the pillar of the community of 4-year-olds, so you might not be contributing to them as if it was a community of your peers. But that's the exception. Most of the time, the reason why you're not going to be using these features is because they're poorly designed, and they might have absolutely no bearing onto the gameplay whatsoever. So developing these irrelevant social features is a dangerous waste of time. Because the best case scenario is that no one's going to use it, honestly. And then you just wasted some time putting in some code, throwing in some features that nobody ends up using, and ends up distracting from why people are actually there, to play that core mechanic that you've been polishing. The worst case scenario is that you're creating opportunities for people to target other people, for people to target anything else that you're holding sacred. The ability to share is actually worse than not having it all together if there's nothing worth sharing, because it's just an opportunity for people to attack each other. But not all games are like this, and in fact some of the most successful in our industry today use these features and use them very effectively to become as lasting as they have. A great example of this is the special call signs and emblems in Call of Duty and Battlefield and the other games of its ilk that directly emphasize the leveling up mechanics of the game that are so essential to its lasting appeal. Besides the fact that they help you quickly identify who it was that shot you, because you can see this little icon there, it gives you a chance to sort of informally brag about how, in addition to going through the paces of playing this game, you were able to achieve something that was actually impressive that you care about. A similar payoff is the White Cloak in Journey. It's a hard-earned testament to a player's tenacity of exploring the rest of this game world, and it fits in very well with this motif of how you're going to look around for these little pieces of cloth and just take in the entire feel of this world. In Farmville, really transformed what people expected out of Facebook gaming, using things that were typically considered to be inert. I'm just going to post on somebody's wall that, hey, I'm playing this game. And they made that a core part of their game. They made it so it's not just going to be an advertisement. It's something that when you click on it, it's going to give you a benefit on your farm and help out your friends. And it builds a sense of community that an otherwise firmly single-player game did not have. So it gives you direct, tangible benefits into your game and can additionally add into some other features. So the pattern here is that these really successful games have their core mechanic very well tied to these social mechanics, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. So before getting in deep with any of those mechanics, I want to address this idea of, we can get those social mechanics in after we're rich. As an indie developer, it's very tempting to think that, but it's extremely unwise, because you're counting your chickens before they hatch. And frankly, your game is not death, it is not taxes, ergo it is not a certainty in life. Thank you, Ben Franklin. And as previously mentioned, if you can do a great job in integrating these mechanics with your core gameplay, that can help get it successful in the first place. So this shouldn't be considered your afterthought any more than your core gameplay should be considered an afterthought of, we'll do that after we get the graphics in. So the last thing I need to address of these developer sort of prejudices is that it's inevitable. You can try all you want, but trolls are on the internet, and c'est la vie. What are you going to do? Now, it is true that you are not going to be able to fix everybody in the world, but using this as an excuse to not try is kind of like owning a dog and allowing him to defecate freely upon the floor, because you know you're not going to be able to let him out every single time, so you might as well get used to it now, right? And that's stupid for a couple of reasons, because first of all, you're going to have to put up with a lot more crap in your house than you otherwise would have to. And secondly, it only takes one dog turd to make that room smell bad. And it only takes one troll, honestly, that's hacking and killing everybody, or just screaming racial obscenities to kind of ruin the game for everybody else. So yeah, it is inevitable, but it's a problem that we need to fight. There is hope, though. Honestly, there is. So there's communities of all ages and genres that are growing every day in their size and their sophistication, and they're building some really, really cool stuff. This is taking it beyond even just interacting inside of the game and building something that means an awful lot more to a lot of people. Simply by helping your players grow in maturity while having a great time, you can help the world get better too, even if you don't have user-generated content. And that means that you're making an environment that your game has people more likely to pick up and stick with, and a player base that's more willing to work with you in developing your community-driven game mechanics as well. So this is a positive feedback loop that can make a game have appeal that lasts for years and years. So it's very well worth our time. So I've established then that this is a problem that all the developers here need to be thinking about. The second part of the talk is addressing exactly how we're going to be addressing this, how we're going to be developing these features specifically, because again, I'm talking about all games here. Now, it sounds pretty obvious, but a lot of developers don't really develop social features the same way that they develop their core gameplay. It's just sort of considered, we're going to take the core gameplay, we're going to make our prototypes, we're going to bash it, play it, and we're going to fully understand why it's fun. But the social ones we can kind of just put in as if it gets in, if it gets in. If we can put in voice chat, cool. And, we've already talked about why that's a bad idea. That's inviting people to start attacking each other in ways that they didn't have to. A great example of how this minimalism in design gets executed is Journey, of course. This is a fantastic title. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. It was made for the PlayStation 3 by That Game Company. Yes, that's their name. And based in Los Angeles, California. So this game won a whole bunch of awards because of its aesthetic and its feel and its user experience, but an enormously important part of this was its multiplayer. The sort of drop in, drop out, kind of quiet, lack of talking mechanic that existed. And I had the fortune of sitting at a talk at a conference kind of like this a few years ago, given by Robin Hunicke, the producer of this game. And they were still under development, and she shared a wealth of information onto what their design process was like and what the motivation was. Because at its core, Journey was supposed to give people an experience that was beyond this hack and slash, beat 'em up, collect it all game that everybody's played before, and instead look for traveling and exploration with companions in a beautiful setting to achieve a truly new feel in a game. So their early prototypes had some unique features. They had 4 players, up to. They had a lot of marauding dragons and stuff, and they had a dangerous environment with a lot of traps that could kill players or leave them in a place where there's only room for one player and someone had to get shoved out. And these are things that seemed, kind of edgy, kind of cool, and fit in with how everybody thought a platformer had to be played. But as they continued playtesting with their groups, they found that their users turned antagonistic towards each other. That a lot of times, rather than traveling, they would focus on, backstabbing each other, pushing each other off of cliffs, and just focusing on their own individual goals. So at this point, they decided they had to make some drastic changes. Either they had to embrace this new direction, or they had to throw a lot of stuff out. And I'm glad to say that they obviously went for the second one. They reduced the number of players, so there's a little bit less noise that was going on, and they reduced the lethality of the game as well. It's a lot harder, I think actually impossible to die. And they also took away the ability to talk to these other players because it wasn't really necessary. All that they needed was the ability to give other people the, hey, I'm over here, I'm doing something. And they could accomplish that with this little ping that puts a little graphic up above somebody, puts out a gentle tone, and lets somebody know that you're trying to get their attention. There's no voice, there's no chat. And the only thing you get is the ability to request the friendship of somebody after the game if you had a good experience with them. It's not because they couldn't, it's because those features would have distracted from why people were there to play this game. The end result is a game that was a huge success, honestly, critically and commercially. And as somebody that's personally had an awesome time, seriously, thank you, That Game Company, for making this game. So, what does that mean for everybody else here? I mean, we're not going to just go off and make the next Journey, right? Although, you should try. This means that you shouldn't implement a social feature unless you think it's going to directly serve your core experience better. You should really understand how this is going to make your game more fun. Who are your players, generally speaking? What are they going to be trying to talk about? How is this feature going to let them do that, and how could it be misused? And how can you fight it? If you have this train of thought at the design process, you can figure out which ones are good ideas, which ones are really bad ideas, and you can kind of prep your team for where some of these statistics you're going to need to measure this are going to come in to verify these hypotheses. This is where your engineering and your design folks are going to have to work together very, very closely. They're going to have to make sure that you're making the best decisions possible for the user experience and that they're feasible. You can consider things outside of the game as well. Are you going to want a forum? Are you going to want a blog, a Twitter? I mean, there's a lot of options out there, but you shouldn't commit to doing these unless you're going to have somebody that's actually going to post on them and moderate them. because otherwise they become ghost towns or filled with bots and, again, worse than worthless. Which brings me to the third point. You need data. This is something that, at least in my experience, perhaps your education was different, but in my experience, it was heavily underemphasized as to the way that the real commercial world of games work. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense, because most academic projects are short enough and small enough that you can directly play or test with people, you can pick their brains for what they were feeling and how they felt, and after you've committed the project and you've gotten your grade on it, then it's usually done. But that's not the way it works. In the real world, you're going to have thousands of people playing this all over the world, and it's just not feasible. And plus, you can learn some very interesting things by just watching people instead of asking them. So, this is something that is done by like every freaking company. And you can do it too. It's as simple as taking whatever cloud-based non-relational database that you like best and deciding that you're going to create a simple taxonomy about it. MMORPGs, MOBAs, social media games, they all need this dramatically. So there's a whole enough here to actually do an entire talk just on data analysis, but I'm just going to pick an example that fits specifically in with protecting your community and go from there. We're going to start talking about Nintendo, the perennial game development powerhouse that is increasingly targeting the young and family-based demographic with their product lines. And most recently, they've been pushing forward a feature that no other developer can match, and that's the ability to draw freely inside of their game and share that with anybody else in the Miiverse. It's something that fits in with their target demographic perfectly. It's something that people can be illiterate, any age, they can quickly pick up and enjoy and share with people, again, of any age, creed, what have you. So the other side of that is, of course, it's extremely prone to abuse with Western audiences and their predisposition to drawing phallic imagery, which I'm not going to show you. But but they chose to address this with a three-part system that, in a lot of ways, models the approaches that you can take in addressing these issues. First, they have an automated defense. The automated defense is an image classification algorithm that looks for suspicious images and will automatically report something that looks a little bit too risque and not let it get posted. Secondly, they have their own crew of moderators that will look over the course of the forums for anything that was, suspicious or something, and potentially flag it, ban somebody, the standard run-of-the-mill things that moderators do. And they also added in some community tools that are the ability to flag users and or the content that are posted into the Miiverse. The great thing about this is, in addition to pulling the moderators in faster than they might otherwise get to something, these reports are added back into that first line of defense that, oh, hey, the classification algorithm was wrong about this other thing that, it didn't look like one penis because it was actually three penises. And you can add that in as another term to the classification algorithm, and it can actually get better at doing these things. So having all of these mechanisms together can actually strengthen each one of them more so than if you did just one. And it's not a perfect system by any means, but honestly, it is very well summed up, at least my experiences, by this Penny Arcade cartoon. That a lot of the, perverted noise that I've come to expect from something with this kind of power is not really around. So, there's a couple of other things that are worth noting as well when you're deciding what platform you're going to publish for, because first of all, most trolls are not going to buy a Wii U just for the purpose of trying to mess with people. I mean, that's a lot more of an investment than just going onto a web browser and playing with some of their games. So depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to safeguard little kids, raising the barrier to entry to your game might not be a bad idea, because it'll be harder for people to get in and mess with it. They are also helped by the fact that by having a proprietary system, they can limit the amount of accounts that you can actually have on any particular Wii. So when you get one banned for life, it's a big deal. It's not like, oh, I can just, get a new IP address or get a new credit card or something like that. Although, even if you're not going for the Wii, you can certainly take steps to make a ban mean more than, again, just a normal IP ban. So it's really a model approach that I think is worth emulating in a number of other ways of handling user-generated content. each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, and you're going to have to do an awful lot of customization to fit whatever your game is. But here's a general sort of rundown of each category and how you should consider it. An automated defense is something that's like a classification algorithm, any kind of security countermeasures you end up putting into your game, potentially something else that is like a statistical auto-mute based on players that have been frequently flagged as offensive or something like that, so other players are not necessarily going to be exposed to them just right off the bat. All of these things are built around the data coming into your game, though. And you need to, first of all, have a source of data coming into your game, or else it ain't going to work. And second of all, you're going to need a good amount of time to continue tweaking this, especially if your game actually does take off and does succeed, because players are notoriously creative for finding funny ways of getting around all of the things that you thought you would finally solved. So you can enhance those measures by getting some level of community involvement in there, at least giving them the option. You can't expect it to be a end-all be-all, especially at launch, because the community just doesn't exist. But if you at least give them the option, they can begin providing you with data actively. And that's something that some of these other companies have, again, done to tremendous effect. Now, of course, both of those are going to need to be overseen by some developer that actually will decide and judge just how effective the system is being. So the amount of admins/developers that you need to have on there is going to, again, vary with the scope and size of your team. But if you have these other two systems in there, when something perplexing does happen, they're going to have an awful lot more information going into the situation as to where the problem's coming from and how they should address it. So even if you decide, we don't have the budget for a lot of these other sorts of things to be sophisticated enough to really handle the problem on its own, it still might make sense to put them in there just to be sort of like a tracer bullet for your admins to figure out exactly what the problem is. So another noteworthy system or part of Nintendo's system is, even though they're a conservative company, this is a very gentle system overall. They have to be conservative because, again, little kids, drawings of penises, you're going to have a bad time. But they still give people the benefit of the doubt. When you sign in for the first time and you post something, there's no delay. It immediately goes live. It's not until you have been caught as an offender that they're going to start putting in some latency that you're going to have to wait for an admin or somebody to come by and check. Now, some of that's because it's cost prohibitive. They had to keep admins around to watch every part of the world, every part of the day. That's an insane cost, and they would have to start charging a fee, kind of like what Xbox does, and that's not their monetization model. But the wonder of this is that as the other links of this chain continue to build and improve, between the other factors of the higher barrier to entry, you're seeing considerably less negative activity than you would otherwise expect from a community like this. And you should also recognize as a developer that while it may be tempting to just start banning everybody, that it really should be your last resort, because they are your customers, and kicking them out can lead to other of their friends leaving, which can be good if they're all assholes, but ultimately, as long as they're there to enjoy the game and they have a chance of being reformed, you're removing your ability to modify their behavior and improve their behavior if you give them a lifetime ban. So having some level of explanation of, hey, here's why you're being kicked off for some amount of time, don't do it again or it's going to get worse, will give you a chance of seeing your players actually come around. A last word on banning, though. Even though you might want to avoid a lifetime ban as much as possible, you need to have an effective mechanism for doing this in any online game. This is both because there are the bad guys out there that are going to they're not reformable, at least not in your game. They're going to only show up to attack your game and other users. You need something that you can use to scare them off. And that's where you're going to want to take a very sophisticated approach as much as possible, looking at a device fingerprint, or tying it to somebody's financial information, just so that it's that much harder for me to spoof that information. So even if you're not super worried about people hacking financial information, which you should, for the sake of preventing players attacking other players, it's well worth having a solid ban mechanism in place. Now, I'll mention that it's possible for any of these things to go wrong. And the tools in particular for automatically trying to check this in particular can be very difficult to get right, depending on how sophisticated your content is. And the more sophisticated your system becomes, the more dangerous it can be when it starts malfunctioning. Now, I'm not going to name any companies or products by name, but I want you to consider, hypothetically, that you figure that piracy is such a huge concern that you're going to mandate some feature that's going to rely on all of your players, maintaining a persistent connection. And it makes sense. It's going to be much harder for somebody to steal this content. But if you end up adding a level of weight to an already shaky back end that causes the whole thing to collapse, I think that's kind of a net loss. You stopped the hackers because you stopped everybody else from playing too. So the point of this is not to keep people out of your game. It's to keep the right people in your game. And keep that in mind for the entire time that you're designing these systems. So what's the lesson from all of these games and these mechanics? And how can you apply them directly? How do you make the decisions about what features are going to be included? Well, for my money, you start off with your target audience. If you're looking for a more mature group of players, something that's into the high school and older range, profanity may be less of a concern than if you're targeting the younger and family-based demographic. So a bigger concern, though, is going to probably be people harassing each other with, spamming the microphone with loud music or something, or racial epithets, what have you. So you might want to consider putting in some more restrictive default privacy settings that make it so people can't just message each other out of the blue, or they can't broadcast to everybody else in the entire zone by default, or at least they have the option of leaving easily. Make sure that you're only seeking to improve that mechanic, not that core mechanic, not impede people from getting to it. After you've considered who your players are, you need to start thinking about what that experience is and really hone in on it that you're trying to give it to them. And if the game needs very quick and clear cross-team communication, like a lot of first-person shooters do, you might want to consider doing something like, say, binding squad commands to keys. This is something that Tribes Ascend, for example, has done a marvelous job of building a macro system that fits its target demographic, which is, game-savvy first-person shooter enthusiasts that can pick it up very quickly. And it doesn't need a microphone. So it's cheaper and easier for more people to use. And it similarly doesn't open the door as wide for people to start harassing the entire rest of the team. So you should also be creative in how you apply your data. I will admit that there are more games that you are all probably thinking of right now than I'm going to be able to imagine and design in my lifetime. So you're going to have to start off with, well, what's unique to your game, and what's the data that you're going to need to track to determine its success? Because if you're going to be unique in the gameplay, why not be unique in the social policy too? Some games, like Defense of the Ancients 2, have made an effort to, for example, isolate the players that are more notorious for leaving or being naughty, and have begun putting them in a separate matchmaking queue, the low priority queue. So it takes them longer to end up getting into the game, and they're typically playing with other assholes. So maybe that's something that works well for you. There's certainly some negative consequences to that as well, of all the bad people staying bad together instead of being reformed, but this is something that you're going to need to have data. You need to figure out what the bad player of your game looks like and how you're going to handle that. And you can't do that if you're not tracking in this data all the time. So begin thinking at the first step of how are people going to attack the experience, and how are you going to know that they are? And that can lead to the feature that makes the most sense for your game. So, and lastly, is you need to be real about this. It's easy to talk about how these approaches were done by all these other companies, but there's a finite amount of time, a finite amount of money, and you still need to, at the end of the day, make a game first. So you can't cripple your product out of an attempt to keep it safe. Make sure that all of these features are as much a part of making it fun as anything else. So that brings me to my last main point. Addressing these social concerns can pay off big time, even if it seems like it's only being done for its own right now. The best example that I can think of, and the one I'm going to focus on, is League of Legends from Riot Games, but there are certainly other examples of this in the industry right now. Now, League of Legends and competitive multiplayer online battle arenas in general have bad reputations as far as games are concerned and their player base. League of Legends is absolutely no exception. So a little bit more than a year ago, Riot found that was actually one of the main reasons that players would leave. They're one of the most frequently cited reasons for quitting the game. So at that time, they put together a team led by Jeffrey, Dr. Light Lin, of behavioral scientists and game designers and statisticians to start addressing this problem in different ways. So he does a talk about this actually at GGC, which is available to everybody, whether you have a Vault Pass or not, and I highly recommend watching, but I'll give you a summary of it. Lin and his team started by putting thousands of hours into this game, playing it, studying it, dissecting the forums, just getting a good understanding of who it is that's playing this game. And they found some interesting things. For example, it's easy to think that it's always just that one guy that's always going to be an asshole in every game that's the result of this, but really it could be anybody. More often than not, the typical play behavior pattern is one player might go for a week and only flare up once because they had that one really bad day that their boss got on their case and, they got freaking yanked by the jungler again because nobody called missing, and they let fly with a couple of offensive words because it's out of there before they even realize they're typing it. And that's no big deal until there's somebody else there at the exact same time that's in a similarly bad mood that responds negatively. And now you have this pissing match that is going to ruin the game for everybody else if it continues. So what they began to do with this understanding of their players is start off with making some very subtle changes. First of all, they tried to make the game a little bit quieter. They defaulted the ability to talk across teams to being disabled. So you had to go through a menu and deliberately say, I want to talk to the other team, rather than just do it by default. They also put in some suggestions into the game, just like on the loading screen, just like a little blurb that could try and enhance player behavior. And best of all about this is they did these things very smartly. They did this over a long period of time. I mean, we're talking weeks and months, and they did this with a number of experiments. That means that they would have multiple versions of their game running at the same time, and they would have a control group that had no changes, and then they'd have, say, one group that would see the suggestion of who's going to be the most sportsman-like player this round, and have it in red text. And then they'd have another one that's running that has it in blue text, another one that's running in white text, and they'd see exactly what happened to the amount of reports that came back from the community, how many of their automated systems would pick up malicious behavior out of these. And, even from something as simple as like loading bar text, there were some really interesting results. They found that the amount of consistently reported hostility and harassment complaints from just the suggestions went down by 17% across these games. And we're talking about a game that has 12 million people playing it every day. So that's a very large number. And similarly, they found that if they did the same thing but in red text, it actually raised the amount of harassment reports that came in. And it could be a spotlighting effect. It could be that people were more looking for that because now they'd seen this. But that's just all the more evidence that these very, very minor things can have very large results if you have some idea of what you're trying to do. So they were emboldened by this success, and they started doing some more drastic things. And this manifested in the two biggest social feature additions into the game in the past several months that I can think of. Those would be the Tribunal system and the Honor Initiative. The Tribunal is essentially a community-based feature that allows players that got banned to appeal their ban to the rest of the community. And this allows other people to view exactly what the text was that somebody said, and what the punishment was, and what the verdict was, and gives more of a dialogue as to exactly why this behavior is unacceptable between the player. The Honor Initiative, on the other hand, is more about rewarding the good that players do. This is something that doesn't actually translate into gameplay benefits. It's just a series of points that are awarded to players for being helpful to new people, for being good sports, for being good teammates, and for being good competitors. And if you do very well, then you end up getting some special cosmetic things. Now, the response to these features is some pretty darn cool numbers. I'll leave most of them out again because that's really more the Riot talk than mine. But a couple that are more jaw-dropping to me was after the Honor Initiative was introduced over I believe there's a 2 or 3 month survey period that they did this, the overall amount of negative player reports that they got decreased by half. That's a game, again, with like 12 million daily users, and if you go by just the sheer number of hours played, it is the most played game in the world, like on a day-to-day basis, which is pretty nuts. Now, the tribunal system has seen close to 300,000 players, actually probably more than that by now, that had been an offender and tried to appeal and had their sentence upheld, and came back to the game and never made an offense again. And yeah, compared to 12 million, 300,000 is not the biggest number, but it's still a pretty darn big number. And besides making those players better citizens for the League of Legends community, that is the tool, or that tool has the potential of making them better for all the rest of the games they go into as well. So it's really hard not to be excited about the ability that game developers have to start to slowly like modify the behavior of their players. And I think we're just getting started, honestly. So to wrap this up in general form, I hope I've managed to convince you that the community is something that we all need to be considering when we're developing these games. That the features that we use to talk to them need to be built just like the game itself. That ultimately it's impossible if you're not tracking data, and you need to be tracking that data early, because every day you're losing it, and you're never going to get it back. And that it is in fact possible for us to make an impact on our players. And if we were doing this consciously over a long period of time, who knows what could happen. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys can make and playing it myself. But yeah, I think that does it for me. So. We still have time for questions as well, if you guys have anything you'd like to ask, and I'll answer to the best of my ability.
Yeah, hi. What is your opinion on free-to-play games? Because you talked a lot about barrier of entry for the Wii U and such, and many free-to-play games, there's really no barrier to re-entry, so to speak. So a permanent ban will just result in the offender just creating a new account. And I heard just some anecdotal saying that that's why many game companies don't ban, because rather restrict the players' accounts so they still have something of value to hold on to, rather than permanently ban, and they'll just create a new one because that's all they can do. What is your opinion on free-to-play games in that type?
I think that it's a design decision that you have to consider very, very carefully, because like you said, there are times that you might just encourage them to leave and come back with unrestricted access. On the other hand, there are definitely games that otherwise it's a fight out there to get as many users into this game as possible. So it boils down to what kind of game you're making and how you're going to monetize if you're making it free to play. With regards to specifically policing players, though, I mean, you're right on as far as giving that account either some more weight to it with something that players don't want to lose, whether that's perhaps some sort of status that allows them to use some other features that now when they get banned or something, it's going to take some time for them to work that back up. Maybe that's equipment that they had earned. You can certainly try and take other measures again, depending on what platform you're using. You're more limited in a browser, but if you're going to be deploying directly to somebody's desktop, you can do more. And as far as like smuggling little invisible files onto their computer that they won't know about. But those are all considerations that you need to be going onto that. As far as my personal take, I think that free-to-play games are here to stay, and they're probably going to grow. But they're certainly not going to be, you're not going to see the end of games that you have to pay for either. So, does that answer your question?
Yes. I have one more.
Sure.
There's also there's been a new thing with certain MMORPGs that they have started, and other games too, that they started punishing more behavior that was before considered not to be punished. Like, for example, using an exploit that's been in the game, that not using malicious code or anything, but just using a certain amount in the game and then getting a gain from that, and then getting banned for that, and players being like, I just used the game, and then they're saying, yes, but you knew that you were doing was wrong, and you knew that you were exploiting the game for your own benefit, and we are going to punish anyone exploiting for that benefit. And that's a new thing that's coming in now. It's changing the moral, ethical space a bit.
And it definitely is, and it's funny that you bring that up, because it's, again, there isn't a yes or no answer to that. I don't even know if that's more of a statement, but it's a very valid statement and a good assessment, because the one that sticks out to my mind is the Diablo 3 gold exploit that was recently going, and it's very difficult, I guess, to say that a developer is with or without it, and of course they're within their rights to pursue that, but is it the actual just thing to do? Again, I think it's something that you see more of that crackdown, because the awareness of subjects like this is growing, and I think that the awareness of how to handle it and the maturity to handle it on developer and player sides have not yet grown to really make the most of that. So hopefully it gets better, I guess. But yeah, that's a very gray area as well. So
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the importance of developer openness to its player base has on the success of a game and how well the community behaves? For example, I think Guild Wars 2 had a Reddit thread around the time it launched, and where people could ask why they were banned, and they would respond with a specific instance of why they were banned. And there was a huge positive response to that. Do you think that the future, do you think incorporating that into game design is very important for upholding a good standard within a online community as well?
I do. I think that there is, dare I say, a nurturing aspect of that it, again, is just not really considered in game development, because it's such an emergent thing in a lot of ways. That said, that's in some ways it is almost like a parent-child relationship, that it's not like you as a game developer are going to go and tell your players everything that's going on with your game. There's a lot of reasons why you can't do that. So, but as far as taking an active presence and making that stuff a reality, I think that's something that a lot of again, you think of the strongest game communities out there, and some of the ones that have lasted longest. And their creators are very visible inside of that as well. So I think it's important. I think it's a hallmark of some of the better communities out there. So
thank you.
Hi. I was wondering about trash talking, because all of the things that you're saying is that we're creating these closed spaces where we aren't allowed to, trash talk as much as we used to, because intimidating your opponent or getting them off their game, and also creating friendship through that, in rare cases. But from what I'm seeing is that trash talking is going to be less of an occurrence in future games. What would you say to that?
Well, what I say to that is I know exactly where you're coming from, because back in my middle school years, I had the foulest of mouths in online games. I mean, it was, and that's where I feel that this topic really resonates with me. And you see it in other, athletic sports too, whether it's basketball, boxing. Muhammad Ali did not have a clean mouth by any stretch. But that's not to say that can't build a friendly rivalry. But I'm not saying you need to get rid of trash talk altogether. What I'm saying is that a lot of the avenues of attack that are used are just not acceptable. It's taking it away from the game. It's taking it away from that sport that you're currently playing on. And yeah, I can understand why that might anger somebody more, but you have to consider the cost of that as well. You can still, in fact, sometimes even more effectively taunt somebody or just be aggressive with them by keeping it relevant to the game. And you're not going to actually hurt societal sorts of standards by promoting some other, frankly, abhorrent concepts that are so well entrenched in our society already. So I think that competitive edge can and should stay there for some games, but I think the flavor of it needs to change if we're going to try and move forward as a society. So
Yeah, there's a thing that what if you're playing on a public server with your friends and you've always had this that relationship, and then in comes this outsider who hasn't been playing much, and I'm gonna report all these people, and
well,
those
and
kind of situations could be really frustrating.
it's a terrific point, but I think then that's actually less the player's fault and more the developer's fault, that they need to recognize that their community, to some extent, enjoys this. And again, we don't know, this is still also hypothetical, we don't know exactly what the extent of this trash talking is. Is this taken to the point of, I'm going to start, packeting your computer? Am I going to, because there's a lot of ways you can mess with somebody that are bordering, increasing levels of unacceptable. And it's not to say that, you used a bad word, you get a lifetime ban. That's not at all the way that should happen. You want to make sure that if you are a developer and you have a community like that, and you want to introduce these standards, that you do so in a way that's not going to make them just quit. You need to do something that will sort of build in that understanding that you can still have this competitive relationship, but you don't have to be insensitive and hurtful to all of these other groups in the world by doing it. So,
sure. All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I was thinking, how about punishing, in lack of other words, players in game, so that when you have these trolls, and you punish them by taking away their gears, for example, or they go down on level and stuff like that.
If your development team has the time to put that in there, do it. Because building in the ability for like that peer pressure, that's the main reason that at least the Riot behavioral science team believes that their tribunal works so well, because it's a game societal pressure, not the development mods saying we're going to make you do this. It's their friends and their co-players that are passing down this judgment. And if you can take it to something either for recognition or for punishment that is fair, but it still means something and is an effective deterrent, you should definitely do that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, but otherwise we can wrap it up if so. I think we're good? All right, thank you very much.
Tycker du?